Hi, I'm Jonathan Rees, history professor and researcher. I'm here to answer your questions from the internet. This is Industrial Revolution Support. With You With Them asks, I'm so gonna fail history. Who the f is Spinning Jenny? The Spinning Jenny is one of the technological innovations that make it possible to automate the textile manufacturing process. There is a thing called the flying shuttle that comes first, and the flying shuttle, the Spinning Jenny, and the power loom together make it possible to automate the process of textile manufacturing all in a single building and put out sheets and sheets of fabric rather than have it done in individual homes and have it take, hours, if not days or weeks. All of them together make textile manufacturing both cheap and more effective and help make the Industrial Revolution possible in the British textile industry. Creators Virtual asks, I wonder if people felt the same level of panic during the Industrial Revolution as they are with AI today. And it's hard not to think about the Industrial Revolution as AI begins to appear everywhere. The thing that I keep coming back to when I think about the history that predates AI is that during the Industrial Revolution, the machines that made stuff made better stuff than the craft workers before them. Cobblers made terrible shoes. Factories made cheap, reliable shoes. The thing about AI that gets me is that the things that AI does, at least at this point in its evolution, aren't nearly as good as the things that they replace. AI writing, for example, something I have to deal with in class all the time, is terrible writing. Apparently, AI, I'm told, is good at coding, but nevertheless, there are still coders who are employed because the higher level tasks involved with coding can't be done by AI. AI has been tried in fast food restaurant takeout, and it keeps messing up people's orders. You're not going to have a real permanent revolution caused by AI unless it can get better at what it's doing. Maybe that's going to happen over time, maybe it won't, but that's the future. I'm a historian, I can't handle that. Dung Magank asks, explain it to me like I'm 5. Why did coal miners bring canaries into the mines with them? Canaries go into coal mines because if the canary drops dead, they know that there's dangerous gas in the mine, and the miners will drop dead shortly thereafterwards. So that was a signal to evacuate the mine immediately. Godbody Mani, Amazon warehouses really remind me of the Industrial Revolution, when mother was losing fingers and I don't know how people be working there for years. The thing about Amazon warehouses is that you're regimented by a machine. And during the Industrial Revolution, the machines controlled your time and how you work and what you did all day. Literally, there were people who would come behind you while you're working with stopwatches and try to measure how long it took you to do just minute tasks so that they can get you to work in the one best way possible in order to be more productive. The thing about the Industrial Revolution and unions is that if they go in as individuals and say this work is very difficult, somebody is just going to find someone who's more desperate than them to do the same job. If they go in together and say this work is very difficult, and if you don't make it better, we're all going to walk out at the same time, then at least they have a fighting chance. Unions starting in the 1880s in the United States are literally the people who invented the weekend. They're also the people who are fighting and will eventually win the 8-hour day. Leisure time opens up for the first time. And they'll do things like take the subway to Coney Island on the weekend and have at least something that they can look forward to during their very difficult 40-plus hour work week. So this question is from Quora. What caused the Great Smog in London 1952? Well, first of all, 1952 is well after the Industrial Revolution, but a lot of that has to do with automobile smoke, which comes out of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, because it depended on coal, has an absolutely enormous impact on the future of the planet. This is where all of the smog starts. And in the turn of the 20th century, smog was seen as a sign of progress before it got everywhere and started really choking our lungs. My adopted hometown of Pueblo, Colorado used to put smoky factories on the postcards that they sold to tourists. Their slogan at the Chamber of Commerce was "Watch our smoke," because that was supposed to be the greatest thing that Pueblo produced. Burn_account_A asks, do you think the Industrial Revolution of Britain could happen without colonialism? Yeah, so that's the Eric Williams argument. He wrote in the 1940s that the wealth generated by that was absolutely essential for having the Industrial Revolution happen. I don't think most historians agree with that, but it was absolutely a factor. Without that kind of wealth, Britain wouldn't have been able to industrialize. But there are other factors as well that make that possible. Your Homicidal Ape asks, most important inventions of the Industrial Revolution. I think the thing that I would probably privilege over all of the possible inventions isn't actually an invention. It's the assembly line, introduced in the Ford Motor Company in 1913, 1914. When they used the assembly line in order to manufacture cars, people in all sorts of different industries go, oh, we could do the same thing in principle in order to manufacture anything. My favorite museum exhibit is in the Henry Ford Museum in Detroit, where they have this thing called the Exploded Model T Ford. And all it is it's all the different parts of the Model T, but they're all slightly separated by each other and hanging on strings. And the reason I love that exhibit so much is that you can actually picture the assembly line just by looking at the parts that put it together, because the whole idea of the assembly line is one person does that one thing, inserts that one part over and over and over again. And you can think about that abstract principle just by looking at a car, but you could manufacture a washing machine that way, you could manufacture a camera that way, turns out you could manufacture anything that way. So I think it's the thing that had the greatest lasting impact, even if it's not a specific invention. XX Gertrude asks, did mothers work at the same factories as their children in the 19th century? I think that question probably has to do with the British textile industry, where there are children and women working in the same factories. In America, probably the most legendary example of child labor is young breaker boys working in the same mines as their fathers. Different industries required child work for different purposes. So in coal mines, for instance, they're picking through giant slag piles in order to find usable pieces of coal out of the refuse of the rest of the mine. In textile mills, they're actually under the looms fixing broken threads. A lot of the times the argument was that the small hands made them better for particular jobs. And the other argument that justifies child labor is that, in a free country, well, how can you stop somebody from doing that kind of work, even if they're a child? This question is from the Political Compass Memes subreddit. Luddites were the OG Tesla vandalizers. So the Luddites were skilled English workers in the textile industry whose jobs were threatened by the innovations of the Industrial Revolution. In order to show that opposition, the Luddites broke the machines that threatened their jobs. What they have in common with the Tesla vandalizers is that they're willing to destroy property in support of their own interests. The funny thing about the Luddites is they're named after a guy named Ned Ludd, who probably didn't exist, and there continues to be strong opposition, usually union opposition, to all kinds of industrial innovations ever since. OK Green 7335 asks, if vast majority were poor during the Industrial Revolution, who was actually buying all the stuff they produced? The great thing about the Industrial Revolution from an economic standpoint is that when you produce more of something, the price of it is going to drop. Henry Ford famously wanted his Model T cars to be affordable to the great mass of Americans. And they were, because he could produce them so much cheaper than any other cars on the market. Low prices meant that even if you don't have as much money as the people who own the factories, you can still afford the products that those factories produced. Accelerator 231 asks, why was steel so difficult to mass produce until the Bessemer process? What were the main stumbling blocks? Steel is really difficult to make, but the more you automate it, the more of it you can make at the same time. So if you go back to the late 1700s, it's really skilled craftsmen who are basically stirring this giant mush of metal in order to get something that's usable and strong. What Bessemer did is he figured out a way to blow air through it in order to automate some of that process and make those earlier, very expensive skills less important. And the open hearth process from the 1890s simply automates it some more. I think it's also worth noting that steel's really important to different aspects of industrialization. In the United States, steel rails are an important innovation that makes the growth of railroads possible in the late 19th century. The steelmaking process is also important for making skyscrapers. And when you get to the 20th century, people make cars out of steel. So steelmaking is just central to all these different industries. Newtonian Ass Pounder asks, did canals of the Industrial Revolution experience traffic jams? Canals where the barges are driven by horses are really only active between like the 1820s and the 1850s or 60s until railroads steal all their market. So canals are just a really narrow period during the Industrial Revolution. It's the early 19th century, both in England and America. Canals are a way to transport the goods that factories produced to lots of different places. And intermittent technology between horses and railroads. So horses are the most important technology in world history until about 1800, when you get steamboats, or a precursor to railroads. The really important driver of the Industrial Revolution in its markets were railroads. Aus Pride always asks, what was the first modern factory? If you ask most historians to name one factory as being most important, I would say it would be Henry Ford's. Ford is responsible for the assembly line, and he was very open about his ideas, so people could tour the factory, and they looked at the way Ford built cars and they said, this is a concept that will work just about everywhere and in any industry. So if we're talking about modern in terms of the fact that you can manufacture anything that way, and in fact so many things are manufactured that way, I would say that Ford's facilities are the most important. So this question is from Quora. Why did the Industrial Revolution lead to large corporations rather than small-scale producers adopting the technology and continue to exist? I think the reason that that happens is that once you make money from the first technological innovations, if you put the profits from that back into your business, that's going to lead to further innovations that will just make your business that much more successful. In the United States, monopolies become a problem in the late 19th century because so many people are making so much money in different industries from these technologies that they control huge sections of that industry and can eventually set prices. America comes up with something called the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 that's supposed to crack down on those kinds of companies, but it's not really enforced particularly well until the 20th century. Even then, it's still just enforced intermittently. Wealth inequality predates the Industrial Revolution, but what you get in the Industrial Revolution for the first time is something called conspicuous consumption, a term invented by the economist Thorstein Veblen around the turn of the 20th century. Conspicuous consumption is buying things and showing them off just to prove how rich you are. That's a direct result of what they used to call new money, making lots of money very quickly and just trying to impress their friends. So this next one is from C.R.R. Pitt. Is there any consensus among historians on why Britain in particular became the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution? This is a very hotly debated subject. The causes of the Industrial Revolution in Britain are manifold. There's an argument that the wealth created by slavery because of the empire makes industrialization possible. There's an argument that enclosure is part of this, that forces people into the cities in order to work in these factories. There are lots of exceptional circumstances that make it so important and why it takes so much longer to appear elsewhere around the world. Seldom Sensible asks, how did the Industrial Revolution benefit the common man? The biggest way the Industrial Revolution benefited the common man is that the price of goods dropped considerably. If you could make something that's more effective, and if you could make it cheaper because you could make more of it, people will just simply have more stuff. Clocks became available to people. Cars became available to people who are absolutely middle class in the United States. Good clothing became possible, clothing that you didn't have to manufacture yourself. That frees up people's time to do other things and to experience leisure. I'm not saying that the costs outweigh the benefits or that the benefits outweighed the cost. That depended on who you are and where you lived. This one's from Quora. How did the first Industrial Revolution cause people to change their skill sets? I think of industrialization as involving two separate phenomena. The first one is the division of labor, where a job is broken up into little pieces. Instead of having one person do all the pieces of that job, they just do the same thing over and over again. The second piece of this is mechanization, where a machine is invented in order to do that job. Division of labor tends to come earlier in industrialization because it's a necessary step to creating a machine that can do that job. So when the job you once did becomes mechanized, the people who own your factory say, well, we don't want you to do that anymore because we have a machine that will do it better. Maybe you're going to be out of work. Maybe they'll let you do another part of the job. But eventually that job is going to be mechanized. There's always has to be workers in the Industrial Revolution to at least move different parts around the factory. But the jobs, as they become more and more mechanized, they become less skilled, and the employers save an enormous amount on wages. That's why unions were so necessary to at least regulate, if not actually stop these kinds of innovations, because people realized that they were the only solution, the only way to fight downward mobility. In late 19th century America, doctors invented a disease that they referred to as neurasthenia. Neurasthenia is basically a way of describing what we might call nervous exhaustion. People who are sort of fed up with the pace of modern life had to retreat to places and resorts just to slow down and decompress. They sold like electric caps, thinking that the electric stimulation will help them get over neurasthenia. It's not so much a fake disease, but it's the first measure that industrialization is impacting people's mental health. The problem with all the treatment for neurasthenia is that it's really designed for the middle class, the people who had money to buy these kinds of things. Workers themselves just had to put up with it because they don't put up with even a very anxiety-producing job, they will starve. This one is from Rustic Bohemian. Did leaving the farm and going to work in a factory really seem like heaven to 19th century farmers? It depends on what the 19th century farmer was doing and what country they lived in. In Great Britain, there's a big problem with the lack of access to any land because of something called enclosure. Enclosure in Great Britain happens when landowners wanted to keep the land for themselves so that they can make a profit from it. And there had been people on those public lands who were farming and supporting themselves. So they are forced to go from the countryside into the city. And when they're in the city, they're willing to take difficult jobs in factories that they wouldn't have been otherwise. In America, it's more of a draw. Lowell in Massachusetts is set up as a wonderful place where not just male workers, but women could go and have a safe place where they can work and earn a living and help their families. I think it's safe to say that as industrialization progressed, it got worse and worse for the workers because their work became more regimented and the pay decreased and the hours increased. Elena Little asks, wait, how many industrial revolutions have we had? The thing about industrialization is that because it's a very long process, there are periods where you get lots of different boosts. And I think some people sometimes mistake boosts for an entirely different industrial revolution. So in Britain in the 1700s, a lot of the innovation deals with energy, so that might be a first industrial revolution. In America in the late 1800s, a lot of the innovation deals with steelmaking. That might be a second industrial revolution. The Henry Ford's assembly line, known as mass production, is a revolution that's really ongoing. Perhaps that's the third. If you're sort of a modern pundit, you might argue that the internet is the beginning of yet another industrial revolution. I just tend to think of it as one long technological process with lots of different innovations that are worth talking about together rather than a separate thing that can be taken out of that long window. This is everything for today. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something. This was Industrial Revolution Support.